Welcome back, everybody, to The Thoughtful Bro. I am your host, Mark Ciso, and I am so happy to have Caroline Leavitt here today, one of my favorite people in the world, a saint of the literary community, an expert on novel writing structure, a founder of A Mighty Blaze. I can just go on and on and on, and I haven't even got to her bio yet. But first, before we get into everything great about Caroline Leavitt, let me just tell you a little bit about the show, in case you didn't know. At the Thoughtful Bro, we are live streaming every Tuesday at 2 on A Mighty Blaze on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. We're here to talk about what makes great books tick, what makes great authors tick. And A Mighty Blaze, if you didn't know, is an all-volunteer initiative to help writers reach readers virtually during COVID and beyond. It was founded during the first week of the COVID crisis by Caroline herself and our colleague, Jenna Blum. At A Mighty Blaze, we're never asking you for money. If you want to show the love, you can just like us and follow us on social media and tell your friends about us and retweet us and all the things. But if you are in the mood to spend money, I have an idea for you. You can spend it on heartfelt stories of complex family dynamics, books about tender misfits in search of community, books about catharsis and redemption, books like Days of Wonder by Caroline Leavitt. We will put many, many links in the chat for you to buy that book. Do yourself a favor. It is a wonderful, wonderful book full of empathy. Empathy is the main word that I would use to describe Caroline Leavitt as a writer, one of the most empathic people you will ever meet. If you have questions for me or more importantly for Caroline, please put them in the chat and they will make their way to me by the end of the interview. We will ask her. Let me tell you a little bit more about Caroline. She is the New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of 13 novels, including With or Without You, Is This Tomorrow, and Pictures of You. She is the recipient of the New York Foundation for the Arts Award in Fiction and the Goldberg Fiction Prize. She's a book critic for the Boston Globe, the San Francisco Chronicle, People Magazine, and the New York Times. She's taught for both Stanford University and UCLA. She is, as I mentioned, one of the co-founders of A Mighty Blaze. Her latest book, Days of Wonder, is about a woman who confesses to a murder as a teenager and then, when released from prison, must try to reunite with a daughter that she hardly knows. It's a story of complicated families, of alienation and ruin, and also of beautifully damaged people. The New York Times writes about the book, Caroline Leavitt has crafted a novel rich in empathy, there's that word, and a story that will resonate with every reader, a novel that shows how past mistakes are in fact doors to a new and more beautiful kind of life. Caroline Leavitt, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I love your show. I love you.
Right back at you. Caroline, I have blathered on about what your book is about. Why don't you, in your own brilliant, concise words, tell us what this story is?
Okay, well, the story started from, my stories all start from things that haunt me. And this particular story started when a friend of mine admitted to me out of the blue that when she was 15, she had committed a murder. And yes, she really did it. And she served time. And while she was in prison, she just was determined to remake herself. And she got her college degree in prison. She became a kinder, better person. And when she got out of prison, she was still a felon, but she established a new career, changed her name, changed her identity, and just became a better person, all the while knowing that she couldn't tell anybody who she really was because she was afraid they'd pull away from her. I love that whole idea of, being an outsider, because I've always felt like an outsider, but I didn't want to impinge on her privacy. So I told her that I wanted to write about that particular thing, but that I would never, ever tell anybody who she was, and I never have, and that I would change the story completely, which I did. And I showed her what the story was going to be. I changed it to a Romeo and Juliet story of these two 15-year-old city kids, New York City kids, who are passionately in love and kept apart by the boy's father. And a murder it's an attempted murder, not a murder. And I made it attempted because the thing that interested me so much is, how do you know if you want to do something, but you don't get to do it? Are you still as guilty as if you really did it? And I did a lot of research, talked to a lot of different people in the law, talked to women who were on probation. And I just really wanted to write a book about what guilt really means, what innocence really means, and what forgiveness really means. Because forgiveness does not mean forgetting that somebody did something bad. It means acknowledging it and trying to do a little better, just trying to do a little better.
Caroline, a lot of people who write fiction do base it on their actual life or kind of crazy stories they've heard in their family, or as you did, a story that a friend told you in confidence. What is your advice to writers who want to write about real life, want to fictionalize real life?
Be careful. I've been sued a couple times. Nothing ever came through. My very first novel had 3 characters, Rosie, Ben, and B. Nelson, which I wanted it to be like the quintessential American family. Rosie had a mental disorder. Right before the book came out, there was all kinds of publicity, and all of a sudden I got a letter from a lawyer saying that that there was a family called Ben, B, and Rosie Neiman, or that's not really the name, but it was like that, who had the same situation. And they wanted to, for me to change all the names, or they would sue to suppress the book. So your first thing is, got to change. I didn't know these people, so this was like just a glitch. But they made me change the names, or they weren't going to publish the book, which was terrible. The next lawsuit I had was when I wrote about an ex-boyfriend who had not let me eat, who was just really controlling. I made sure to. I changed his name. I changed his appearance. I changed his profession. And he still sued. And I got a call from Random House saying, he was very upset. His wife was upset. And I repeated to them, I changed the name, changed everything else. And the one question they asked me was, did he know about this? Did you tell him that you were writing about him? And I said, of course not. So they made him go away. It's interesting too, there was the book, The Help, where the woman who wrote The Help about the black maids who raised her, she was sued by one of her original black maids who said, well, you took my stories. And it went to court, and it was thrown out of court because the author had given the black maid the book to read, saying, look, I wrote this. I just want to make sure you're okay with this. And the woman never read it. So she sort of lost her chance. So my advice is, if you're friendly with those people, ask them. Always ask for permission. If you're not friendly with them, then you've got to change the names, change their appearance, change the city, change everything you can. And, be careful. If somebody is like the president of the National Dog Society, and you write a book about some guy who's the president of the National Dog Society who is a sex offender, you could be sued because there's only one president of that place. So you'd have to change it to a different society. But you do have to be careful, and you do have to think in terms of what are the damages? How is this going to impact someone that you're writing about? Because you always want to be kind.
All right, let's think of like the different sources of what a story could be. So a story can come from the life of somebody or your own life, like your own experience. And that's just what we've been talking about. Your story could come from just your imagination. The story could come from something that you didn't experience, but like you read about, like say in a newspaper. And a fourth place a story could come from would be like from tropes, just like using kind of genre conventions. So like, let's say those are like the 4 areas. Why would you so often in your career choose stories that either happened to you or that happened to people that what's more appealing about that gets you going as an artist?
Because I'm haunted. It has to do with emotional health for me. I'm haunted by these things, and I keep thinking about them and ruminating about them and talking about them with people. And the only way I can figure them out is to write about them. I mean, I was talking with Chuck before we got on here about why we write serious stories and why we're so drawn to stories about murder and mayhem when our lives are sort of happy. And, I'm a very silly person. And I think it's because I deal with that stuff in my work. I mean, that's the stuff I think about all the time. Like, what if this happens? Or how do you live when something like that happens? I can't figure it out for myself, but my characters somehow can. And so that's what I do to them. And they're probably all waiting for me outside to yell at me for doing it. But that's what happens.
All right. So I would say that across your novels, one thing that you are just so drawn to as subject matter and something that you're so known for among your readers, this is something your readers love about your work and expect about your work, is the kind of very empathic portraits that you paint about outsiders, people who maybe want to be in a community but can't find their way into a community. I think your heart really is with the outsider, the anxious, the fretful, the tender.
That's me.
Yeah. Why is that? Why does that get you going as a writer?
Well, I grew up as one of the only Jewish families in a Christian working class neighborhood. So all the other kids were always running up to me saying, "Where are your horns?" Or, "You killed Christ." And I was 5 years old and I had no idea what they were talking about. And even my elementary school was like that. All the Catholic kids, it's a very Catholic neighborhood, all the Catholic kids would go to catechism. And I would be the only one staying in the school because I couldn't go because I was Jewish. I didn't know Jewish kids, and I felt very much like an outsider. And it was really, really painful to me, so I escaped in books. I also grew up in a really kind of a brutal family. My father was abusive. My mother was very loving, but very tormented. And my sister she had a lot of emotional problems. And I was always being told, I was too this, I was too that, I didn't fit in, why couldn't I be like this, blah, blah, blah. And, that went on. In high school, I always got threats to be beaten up, and things didn't start to open up for me until I was in college, when I just went to a more diverse college and I found my tribe. And I began to realize that it's all about finding your tribe. Yeah. It's really, there's no such thing as an outsider, because you just have to find your tribe, and then your tribe will come to you, and then you're no longer an outsider. And that idea just has always haunted me. And that's what I like to write about.
So I want to talk about how the novel is structured. And
okay.
I want everybody to know that Caroline and I are both just complete structure freaks. We're obsessed with how to structure long form stories. And we're going to spend a lot of the interview in a few minutes. We're going to start talking about that. And so just please hang on tight for that. Anybody who thinks about how stories are put together or is trying to put together a story of their own, we'll get into that in a minute. But before I move on to one of the questions about how this particular novel is structured, I just want to make sure that we answered this one question, because I know the answer to this question, but I'm not sure we actually got it answered here on this show. That the person whose story this friend of yours, is somebody you're not letting anybody know who they were, and you're going to take that secret to the grave with you. Can you just talk though for a moment about, this person who actually did commit this murder and spend time in prison, how did you manage writing this book with them in your life?
Well, I always use the example of, there's different sorts of people who do bad things. There's somebody like Charles Manson who said repeatedly while he was alive, "If you let me out, I'm going to kill again. I'm going to do the exact same thing." No change, no remorse. Then there is Leslie Van Houten, the last of the Manson girls, who was, 17 or something when the murders occurred. And she changed while she was in prison. She was full of remorse. She got college degrees. She became a peer leader. There was no reason not to let her out. And there is something that is called restorative justice. And what that means is that you can have done a crime, but if you're not the same person you are now that you were at, say, 15, which my friend most assuredly is not and was not, and you try, it doesn't mean that you erase it. My friend always admitted that she did this crime and she knew why she did it and she felt terrible about it. But she spends her life trying to be a better person and a wonderful friend. And she is. So it's almost like holding two different thoughts in your head at the same time. Yes, we all remember who we were at 15. Yes, at 15, she murdered somebody deliberately. But now, at whatever age she is, which I'm not going to say, she's a totally different person. She doesn't recognize who she was at 15 anymore. So why should we?
Can you tell me the story of actually the moment that she told this to you? So first of all, to the extent that you can, because I know you're very protective of her identity and I'm not trying to figure that out, but just, why did she bring this up to you? It seems like a big thing to bring up. And then what was your sort of immediate reaction on hearing this about your friend?
Well, she trusted me. We had been friends for about 2 years, and she trusted me. And I'm really open, and I'll talk about anything in my life. I'm sort of an open book. I had told her a lot of like really personal stories, and we were just talking about the things we carry with us, and shame and that kind of stuff. And she just told me. And when she told me, at first I wasn't quite sure because it was like she had split into two, the person I knew and the person she was when she was 15. And then I just listened. I just listened to her talk about it, and I found that I was feeling deep compassion. It wasn't like listening to Charlie Manson saying, I'm going to get out, I'm going to do it again, I'm going to do it again until I, create mayhem. It was somebody who was being very thoughtful, who owned what she did. She wasn't making excuses. She owned what she did. She deeply regretted it. And I thought, to me, that was amazing because, who knows what you're capable of in any situation. I mean, you have kids. If someone came in and threatened your kids, you might kill somebody. I mean, if someone threatened my son when he was young, I might kill them too. I mean, it's sort of like, even if there's another avenue to do. And that whole thing about what we're capable of and how we change was just really, really interesting to me.
Well, I mean, it's just kind of a life imitating art kind of thing in a way, in the sense that like you are just this, as we've said so many times already on this show, you're such an empathic person. I almost feel like this friend is so lucky to have been your friend, because you, of all people, who are always writing about people with troubled pasts, people who are looking for understanding and looking for somebody to kind of see them and the good inside them. What a perfect person for your friend to have told the story to.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. I just feel like, it's like, I think it's a Rumi poem where he says, well, we're all just really walking each other home. And, what that means is we're just, if you can be kind to somebody, to some people, that's everything. And that can change their lives.
We have a question from the audience here that I won't save to the end. I'll just put it up right now. Renee asks, did your friend read the book? And if so, what was her reaction?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot. You know what? I never asked her if she read the book, and she never told me. I just sort of feel like if she wants to tell me, she can. If she doesn't, that's fine. And actually, the book is a mutual friend of ours who knows the story, said, there's nothing of her in this book, even though I know there is. My friend said, anybody reading it would not see any of her in the book, so you did your job. So I feel okay about that.
All right, well, let's move on to just one more question I have specifically about the book before we talk about our obsession with novel structure. The book is written in different time periods. It sort of tracks a few different relationships across, back, 20 years ago, and then 10 years ago, and then the present, roughly speaking. And I'm just wondering about how you kind of manage that structurally. I mean, I heard you say in a lecture you gave that, it's all about cause and effect. And because this happened, another terrible thing has to happen. And that happened, the next thing happened. It's just this kind of Aristotelian chain of causality. But that is harder in, events that are separated by 10 years or 7 years. And I'm just curious, did you look at each one of those time periods as its own little story, or how did you think about structure with this?
It was really hard. This was my first book that really had a dual structure with two distinct stories going in parallel things. And the reason when I first started, I started doing it chronologically, and it just was too bogged down in backstory. It's kind of like, what's going to happen? What's the conflict here? So then I tried to do what most writers do, which is to weave in the backstory. But because the backstory was so huge, the backstory is just about these two kids and the murder, and the regular front story is what happens once she gets released from prison. But because both stories were so big, I thought I have to do a dual timeline. And I didn't really know how to do that. So first what I did was I got Post-its and I wrote out all the scenes of the story of the kids when they're kids and tried to figure out, well, which goes where. Then I took another set of Post-its and I wrote all this things that would happen after Ella gets out of prison. And then I had to figure, well, where do they go? How do I mix them up? And I actually talked to a lot of writers because I didn't know how to do it. I just did not know how to do it, how to make it worse. Because if you're talking about the past and you end a chapter, you want the reader to say, oh my God, what's going to happen? And then you're going to introduce something in the present. You have to do the same thing with that. So I actually spoke to I have a friend, the writer Jonathan Evison, who's just wonderful. And I asked him, how do you do this? Because he does that all the time. And he said, well, when you end a chapter in the past, say you want it somehow to connect up to the chapter 10 years ahead of it. And you can do it several ways. You can do it with emotion. If somebody in the past is crying, you can start the chapter in the present saying, Ella never cried until she blah, 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 blah. You can even do it with a color. Like if the chapter ends with somebody wearing a blue shirt, you can go 10 years in the future and say, so-and-so was wearing a blue dress when such and such a thing happened. Or you can do it thematically. If somebody in the past is going on a first date, then you have the people in the future going on a first date. It's all you just have to sort of connect it, and it's hard. It's really hard, and there's a lot of mistakes, and I had a whole lot of help doing it. But that's how it hangs together, those connections. And those connections, as you know, are all about structure. And I just want to say that people out there, if you think you hate structure, I know a lot of people who only use structural tools after they've written their novel, just to tighten it up and make sure the beats are there. So, it's good for everybody. It's good for everybody, I think.
Well, I think one of the reasons why it works in this book is because there's such a strong why done it in the past story. It's like this woman, Ella, who doesn't seem like a cold-blooded killer, but that she spent time in prison for this crime that she confessed to, and you just want to think, like, what? Like, how could this person have done that, and why? And so, I think what I'm trying to say is the trick of making that backstory so compelling is that it's a story that needs an answer. You got to find out why she did it,
and you got to feel it. Yeah, you got to feel it and experience it for yourself as a reader. Otherwise, you're just being told. And when you're told, you don't get the same emotional thump in your chest.
All right, so let's pivot to structure generally.
Good.
Caroline and I are both obsessed with structuring novels, and we have very different ways of going about it. But I think we absolutely agree on how important it is and how it saves you time and it creates a better final book, and just sort of all the things. But Caroline, I've heard you say that structuring or structural theory and the idea of working with structure on your novels, quote, saved your life.
It did.
And the one other thing about it is that I was recently at an event with you and Ann Hood speaking, and both of you confessed to being structuralist, but both of you said you had written several novels, published several novels before you took structure seriously. So just tell us how this kind of epiphany and this evolution happened.
Yeah, it's like my novels were my first 6, maybe 8 novels were written waiting for the muse. I had an idea and I would come out with 800-page novels, which everybody knows is that's way too long. And they were all over the place. And I wouldn't know what I had written. And I would spend the next 2 years trying to figure out what's the story. So finally, I was writing my 9th novel, and I had a student at UCLA say, "Do you know about story structure?" And I said, "No, I'm not that kind of writer. I'm not going to outline. No surprises for the writer, no surprises for the reader." And this person said, "Well, I just took this story structure class from this guy, John Truby in LA, and I want to send you the tapes." And I said, "Please don't do that." And she said, No, I'm just going to send you one tape. I guarantee you'll like it." So she sent me this tape, and I said, "Oh, Jesus." So I started listening to it, and Truby started talking about how things are structured. It's almost like we all have skeletons. Think how different all of us are, but we all have skeletons that keep us up. What makes us different are some of us have different colored flesh. Some of us have more flesh. We make ourselves different by what we wear or our hair or everything else, but we can stand because of that skeleton. And Truby started talking about things I never heard of before, like he calls them moral choices. I don't like the word moral, so I tend to call it everything has a cost choices. It's sort of like the more terrible choices you can give your characters, the more we learn about them. It's sort of like you can choose to, if your wife is dying and the only person who has the antidote is a pharmacist and he wants $10,000 and he won't give it to you, you can either steal the drug. And the good thing is that your wife will get better. The bad thing is you'll go to prison, or you can be a good citizen and not steal the drug. And the cost is then your wife dies. He talks about reversals and reveals and how things connect. And I thought, well, maybe I'll try this. So I tried it on my 9th novel, which actually became my first, my 9th novel. It made it so much easier. Not that it's easy, but it made it so much easier. And it was my first New York Times bestseller, which was totally shocking to me, because literally even after 8 novels, nobody knew who I was. But then all of a sudden with his 9th novel, they did. And it was because of structure. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to really look into this and learn more and try more. And now I won't write a novel without it. I just won't write a novel without it, because I think you're right. It makes things easier. And to people who say it's not as creative, it's more creative, because once you do structure, it doesn't mean you're married to that structure. You can change your thinking, plots change, you still get into the zone, but it just really makes for a better story.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's not creative argument that, because you get a lot of pushback. Believe me, I do. When I talk about structure, and people think, you just get the feeling among literary writers that they think it's oppressive. They think it's too Hollywood. I mean, I know John Truby does a lot of.
He is very Hollywood, but that doesn't mean.
Yeah, right. But people think, literary fiction is some kind of like oasis where you don't have to follow the rules, or you don't have to really tell a story with cause and effect, and all these kinds of things that people say. But to me, creating a story is just as creative as actually writing the prose. And I think people get confused about it. They think if you're not actually writing sentences, somehow that's not the creative act. But to me, it's just like, well, here's the thing. Like, let's say we're building a house. There's a creative aspect to figuring out where you're going to build the house. There's a creative aspect to drawing the blueprints. There's a creative aspect to building the house. There's a creative aspect to furnishing the house. There's just different stages. Each is sort of creative in its own way. And to me, sort of beating out a story and figuring out, what the act structure is and all that is just a different kind of creative act that's just as exciting.
Absolutely. And let's look at, one of the most literary writers I know and love is Lauren Groff. If you look at Fates and Furies, that's structure. The first half is the husband's story about what happened in their marriage. And then there's a reversal, huge story structure term, reversal. The second half is the wife's story, which upends everything you thought you knew from the first half. The Vaster Wilds it's structure. It's about a young girl in the 16th century who's running. We don't know why, but we read to find out, why is she running? What's going to happen to her? That's structure. That's structure. And I think, certainly there are some experimental novels which are all over the place, but they still have a structure in themselves. Maybe their structure is to be all over the place, but I think it's a mistake to say it's not creative, because it really helps you find the deeper creativity, I think.
So you talk about the story question, like the
Mm-hmm.
question of the story, and that seems like this like essential
Yeah.
ingredient for you, knowing what the story question is. And I've heard you say that for people to write a great book, they have to have a story question that is deeply meaningful to them personally.
Yes.
And only when the story question is related to something you are deeply wrestling with in your own life, only then will it become a universal kind of story. Can you
Yes.
talk about what this story question is and how you find it
Yes.
for works?
Well, I think it's always a good idea to keep track of what's haunting you at the
Mm,
time and what interests you. Like, what kinds of stories interest you? What do you read? I mean, for me, Days of Wonder is not about me. I'm not in the story, but what haunts me is in the story, which is, what does it mean to be an outsider? How do you find community? I'm always, always haunted about it. That's my personal story. And it's interesting because when I teach structure at UCLA, I always ask the students, tell me what's haunting you. And a lot of them bristle because they feel like, well, that's personal. I'm not going to write about myself. And I keep saying, you don't have to write about yourself. It's just kind of like what interests you, you can give to other characters, but you sort of have to know, what is the thing that haunts you that you're trying to figure out? And that is what makes it universal. It's sort of like people who are ashamed of stuff. They don't want to say it out loud, or they don't want to say it. But when you do say it out loud, then there's always somebody coming up to you whispering, saying, oh my God, thank you, thank you. I feel that too. I think writers are the canaries in the coal mine. We go to those deep places that other people, they may want to go there, but they're afraid, or they just don't want to face it, or they'd rather put an extra layer over it so they don't have to feel it. But we go there so others can safely feel that. And that's what makes it universal.
yeah. Let's give an example of one other story question. Let's say like The Great Gatsby. What's like
Okay.
the story question in The Great Gatsby?
Okay. Well, people make the mistake with The Great Gatsby and thinking that the book is about Gatsby, and it's not. The book is Nick Carraway's story. And the reason why I love that book so much is, guess what? Nick Carraway is an outsider. He's poor. He was on the poor side of town. He wants to belong. He wants to be rich. He thinks his problems will be solved by that. The story question in that Fitzgerald had was, for himself, was, are the rich different from you and I? Because Fitzgerald spent all his life trying to be rich and trying to be one of them, and wondering how he could not be different, how he could be one of them. Because, like Nick Carraway, Fitzgerald had been born without any money. He fell in love with a very wealthy woman, Zelda. He felt he wasn't good enough for her. And I think the question in The Great Gatsby is, how do I become good enough? And that question is posed at the beginning of Gatsby, and is answered at the end in a very interesting way, where Nick Carraway becomes good enough by walking away from the very thing that he wanted. He just gives it up. He walks away. We don't know where he's going or what's going. We just know that he's realized his own self-worth, that he is good enough, but not with those wealthy people. And that's why it's such a great novel, because everyone feels that to some extent.
And I've heard you say before that there's this idea of wants and needs. I mean, this is an idea that's talked a lot about actually in storytelling theory.
Yeah, it is. Everybody has it.
Yeah, and sort of people have a misperception often at the beginning of the story about what they want, and in the end they get what they need, but they don't get what they want. What's interesting though is that I think there's like a little thing you can add to that, which is like, and The Great Gatsby is a great example of it in the way that you just laid it out, which is that Nick doesn't get what he wants, but he gets what he needs. And also what he gets is some wisdom about the thing that he wanted. That's like the extra thing.
That's right. That's an extra thing. And that's very smart. And I'm actually going to write that down to add, because that's really good. Okay. Wisdom about, you realize, you're actually right. He does realize that, there's a cost there's a cost to being rich and seeming to have it all.
Yeah.
And it's too big a cost.
Yeah.
It's too big a cost. Those people are careless people, and you don't want to he doesn't want to live his life like that.
Right.
But that's right. That's absolutely right. It's a totally different thing.
Okay, let's talk about character now.
Okay.
And so here's an idea that I have been thinking about recently, and I want to see what you think about it. I mean, obviously character is something that's very important, and often the way that character is talked about in storytelling is that stories are about how characters go through a change. Now, I think that like describing it that way has always been a little bit tricky for me because I think like, it's like, do people ever really change, or are they just sort of their true characters revealed and they've always been that way? Like, do people's like DNA change? Like, what actually literally changes? I just think that change is sort of a tricky word.
Right.
So the way that I have come to think about it is, and this may be too reductive, but like a character is a way of doing things. A character is like a way of living life. And then what happens in a story is that way of living life is revealed to be inadequate. It's like some antagonist comes along and their normal way of doing things is no longer works.
Yes.
Or some other catastrophe happens in their life, and they have to change, not like themselves, but they have to change their way of doing things in life. And I'm just kind of curious what your take is on that. You're the first person who's hearing this brand new theory of mine.
I love it. I'm writing it down on a Post-it because I think it's so brilliant. You're right. It's like, because people don't, an unhappy person or a person who's depressed is not going to suddenly be happy all the time.
Right.
But they can live their life differently. And I think that's absolutely brilliant, because change is, you're right. It's how you choose to live your life in a way that makes sense. I mean, there's a really interesting book called Leaving Las Vegas, which actually was a wonderful film where Nick Cage was great in it. I think he won an award for it. And Nick Cage, the main character, never changes. He really never changes. His wife and kid were killed. He feels it's his fault. He wants to drink himself to death. That's what he wants. That's what he does at the end. The character who changes is the sub-character, who is the prostitute he hires to help him kill himself. And she changes the way she lives. She doesn't change who she is. She's still a prostitute at the end, but she falls in love with this guy. And so there's a cost and a choice. If she helps him kill himself, she's doing a loving act and she's helping him. But the cost is she'll go to jail and she loses the person she loves. But if she doesn't help him, he's probably going to do it anyway. And then she still loses the person she loves. But the way she changes at the end, she's, for the first time, she's true to herself. And she does something that's totally giving. It isn't that she's changed, but I loved what you said. She's changing the way she's living, and being true to her feelings, true to herself, and doing something for somebody else that isn't doesn't have a monetary consideration. So I think that's great, and I'm going to actually steal that when I teach story structure, and I'll credit it to you. But I think that's a great way of looking at it. It's really, really brilliant.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's move on for a few other topics before we wrap here. You talk about how important writing a synopsis is. I know this is something that you believe. But what's most interesting to me about this is not just that you're writing, say, like a 20, 30 page kind of outline of your story before you start. But here's the part that I really love about that, which is also what I do. But you share it with other people. You share the synopsis. And I think, if I'm understanding right, you share it before you start writing the novel. If that, first, tell me, is that right? And second, tell me about like what you get from that.
It's absolutely right. By sharing it, I share it with people who know structure. I'm not going to share it just with a regular person, because I'm looking for specific things. I'm looking, are the beats all there? Do you see the wants? Do you see the needs? Do you see, does the person have a scar, something that haunts them? What's their misconception? Is it building? I shared first with this guy named Jeff Lyons, who is a story structure guy, and he will look through it and say, no, this doesn't work, or what about this? And, you should do this. Then I share it with Stephanie Ganji, who wrote The Next and Carry the Dog. And she tells me, no, you're starting it. She told me actually in the novel I'm writing now, you're starting in the wrong place. That's why it's not working. And we went back and forth. And I said, no, I'm not. Yes, you are. And then I came to realize, oh my God, she's right. I'm starting in the wrong place. And then I share it with my niece, Hilary Strong, who's a brilliant writer, because we share the same DNA and she thinks the way I think. And it's very, very helpful. And I will rewrite it like 5 or 6 or 8 or 20 times until I feel like, okay, all the beats are there. Meaning that the skeleton is there, not the flesh, not the other stuff, not the creativity. And then what I do is I will circle a scene I want to write. Sometimes it's the last scene, and I'll circle it in red, and then I'll go back and forth until I've sort of cobbled the pieces together, and then I'll read the whole thing through again. But it's really important to me physically and also psychologically, because if I look over there and see that synopsis, then I feel like, well, I have a novel. I can't give it up now, no matter how hard it is. If there's a problem, I just have to work harder. I mean, do you do that? Do you have a synopsis?
Oh yeah. I mean, I have synopses of, like, in fact, every chapter before I
I love it. I love it.
start writing them. And I want to just hone in on this for a second. So this we have a kind of a straw man that we've set up here of, like, the literary writer who, like, hates structure and doesn't want to hear anything we have to say about it and feels like it's oppressive. But this is like one of the most common articles of pushback from people against structure. And what they say is, I just feel trapped by it. And I feel like I have to obey my outline. Or they're like, well, I tried writing an outline once and I threw the whole thing away.
But that's okay.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I would argue is just
it's okay to do it.
Yeah. So, but even the act of having written it and thrown it away has, like, what the implication is like you tried thinking about it one way and that didn't work. And now you found a better way. So it was
a better way. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that's like another brilliant statement I'm going to write down here. But that's true. It's like you find a better way. Like when people say, oh, no surprises, that's not true. Because say you've written a scene, you say, okay, this scene is going to start with this guy dragging a kid out of the room, and you say, okay, that's it. And then you write the scene and something's off with it and you don't know why. And then you go back and you look at the story and you realize, oh, this scene should come like way at the end, if at all. And then you rearrange the whole synopsis. It's a better way of doing things. That's a surprise to me that the scene didn't feel right there when I wrote it. Because when I put in the synopsis, it seemed right. But when you write it, you're using a different part of your brain. You're going deeper into the zone, and there's going to be lots of surprises. And I mean, I hate this whole thing with genre anyway, like where people say, oh, is it literary? Is it commercial? Is it upmarket? Those are marketing decisions, and they shouldn't be any business for the writer. I mean, I think write the story that you care about, that you really want. And when it comes to genre, let marketing figure it out, which they will, because they want to sell the book. It's not your business.
Right. All right, let's do a couple more quick questions, then we'll take a question from the audience.
Okay.
You have been very clear about the importance of getting that story question, the big story question of the book, into the first chapter.
Yeah.
Tell me why it's so important to get the big question of the book up front right away.
Because readers sort of want to know, what are they reading? What's the deeper reason that they're reading for? I mean, they may not even know it, but you know it as a writer. This question is posed at the beginning, and the character thinks they know what they have to do to answer that, but then it's answered at the end in a very different way. I mean, Nick Carraway's story question at the beginning was, how do I belong to this group of rich people? And the answer at the end is, I don't. I'm walking away. I don't want to. I don't want this anymore. I need something else. And the beginning and the end sort of dovetail in this really interesting way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. Let's do one more question from me. You, I know, feel that novel writing is the greatest thing a human being can do.
I do.
I know you do. Just tell us why.
because you get to live other lives and you get to touch other people and you get to connect with them, and it's creative and it just feels so great. Even when it's terrible, it's wonderful. It just, I've had a lot of different jobs and I've been fired from a lot of different jobs. And I had some jobs I was successful with, but it's sort of like there's nothing that's more wonderful than creating these people and living with them. And there's something just magical about it, and about being able to inhabit other lives and feel what other people feel and make yourself cry. And just, it gets out a lot of demons from me too, where when I finish a book, I start to understand truly what I was writing about. And it helps me. I always say I probably would have severe mental disabilities if I wasn't able to write, because I get a lot of that angst out there. And it's just and there's also happiness writing. I love it. I just love it so much. I'm so glad I get to do it.
I feel the same way myself.
Yep. I'm sure you do. I know you do.
Oh my God. Like I always say, like, I get paid to write now, but I would pay to write if I had to pay.
Me too. Me too.
I would pay to do it.
I would pay to do it too. It's incredible.
All right, let's take a couple questions from the audience. This one is actually for me, and so I'm.
Oh, good. Okay, I'd love to hear that.
Mark, do you have a story question before you wrote your book? So my book, Bunyan and Henry, or The Beautiful Destiny,
which is wonderful, which people should buy immediately.
Thank you, Caroline. I would just quickly answer that question and say, I think the real story question of my book, and it is laid out on the first page or so, is this question of like, when should you shy away from change, and when should you take the leap and follow what the book calls the twisty path to the beautiful destiny? The book is all about these hunches that we have about, could we lead another life, a higher life, a better life, a more beautiful life? And there's always something for all of us that's sort of on the periphery. Like you'd like to make a change, like into your body, to your job, to your relationships, but you're just not quite ready to do it yet. And when is the moment that you will take a leap, and even take a huge leap, and follow some irrational hunch that everybody else will say, like, that's crazy. To do what you're doing is crazy. But should you do the crazy thing? That's sort of the question of the book.
That's what you did in your personal life, though, when you gave up your job and became a writer, which is amazing. Amazing, right. Amazing, amazing.
All right, let's take another question here. This one is from Elaine. If you know someone, for you, Caroline, if you know someone has read a book of yours and says nothing, what do you tend to think? If somebody read it, they're just not writing, they're not texting you like, great job, they're not texting anything.
Different books are for different people. I mean, it used to really bother me. I used to be really upset about it. But the thing is, not everybody's going to love your book. And sometimes, sometimes people don't love your book because it comes too close to something they're going through. Some people may not just like your writing, and that's okay. I'm fine about that. What I wouldn't be fine about if somebody I knew wrote a really bad public review of it. That would be different. That would be unforgivable. But, if they don't say anything, then I'm never going to ask, because people have a right not to like stuff. And, that's fine. They'll still be my friend as long as they don't write that 1-star review.
Oh my God. I heard a story once of a friend who was like, sometimes you ask your friend, you say like, hey, can you just like leave a nice review about my book? Like, you're just talking and they enjoyed your book. Like, hey, can you just leave a nice review? I had this friend who told me a story of like, they were talking to a friend. The friend is like, yeah, I liked your book. It was great. They're like, oh, could you just leave a review on Amazon? And they left a 3-star review.
What?
It's like, with friends like these, who needs enemies?
Oh my God, no, that's terrible. That's terrible. Yeah. You have to sort of like just, I never read my reviews on Amazon and Goodreads, because I've learned that it just makes you feel bad. It's like, it just makes you feel bad if they're bad. And sometimes if they're good, then, it just doesn't make sense to do it. I just try to leave them alone.
Yeah, I'm very new to this game. My book's only been out 2 months, but I have learned very quickly that the good reviews are sort of just like, they don't even make a dent, but the bad reviews like make your palms sweat.
Yes, that's right.
grow up. So it's just not worth it. Anyway, Caroline, this has been wonderful. I want to ask you my one last question.
Okay.
I love to ask every writer who comes on the show. So imagine the ideal reader for your new book, Days of Wonder. They get to the end of the book, they close the book, they sit there, they're staring out the window, and the book is in their lap. Just describe for us in a phrase or even just a single word, how does that reader feel?
Oh, I would like to say gutted with hope. It's not a single word. It's sort of like gutted with hope. I want them, real change often comes out of pain. And I want them to feel sort of like, oh my God, but then also sort of feel it's not the end of the world. There's still a world, there's still possibilities, and just hope. I want them to feel like they've been through something, but I like the word gutted, but I have to add hope to it too.
Well, I would just add, it's beautifully said, but I mean, I think it's funny. I was reading some of your reviews of this book, and like, there's always a thing that comes up when people talk about your work that is like this kind of these like oxymorons, like it's like beautiful misfits, or like they're like ruined but they're wonderful or something. And it's like, and this like gutted hope thing is the same way. I mean, I think you're always just finding the beauty in the hardship and the tragedy.
Yeah, I mean, my family used to call me, and not in a nice way, Pollyanna, because I always look for but I feel like, if you've been through a lot of tough times or a lot of terrible tragedies, you always have two possibilities. You can let yourself be beaten by them and just be crushed, or you can be crushed and then say, okay, it's like what you said, how do I live a better life now because of those tragedies? Because what you find is that when you've been through tragedies, if you think about it, it makes the good stuff that comes later so much better. I mean, I think you appreciate love and joy so much brighter and better because you've gone through periods where you didn't have that at all, or it was crushed in front of you. So that's what I try to do.
What an outlook. What a beautiful way to end the interview. Caroline Leavitt, this has been such a pleasure. I knew it would be. You're a dear, dear friend. You're a mentor for me. You're someone
You're a mentor for me. Look at all my post-its I wrote for you.
I deeply admire you and everything you've done with your wonderful career. And so thank you for being here on the show. And I know
Thank you so much.
We had a big crowd today. They enjoyed it too. So folks, the book is called Days of Wonder. Please, I see a bunch of you are saying in the chat right now that you're going to go buy it immediately.
Thank you. Thank you.
So please buy it and leave a kind review if you
Yes, leave a kind review, please. Thank you all so much. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next week on Thoughtful Bro.